Depressingly, we ended the politics show in 2024 by talking about Elon Musk. I'm sorry to say he is back for more, and no doubt will be throughout the year. He has increased his, what should we call it, meddling, spreading misinformation, trolling perhaps in politics, in UK politics even, in 2025. We are going to come to his relationship with Reform UK in the second half of the programme, but let's start with the conversation on grooming gangs. One of the most shameful episodes of British history, where thousands of vulnerable girls across the country were sexually exploited and raped over a period of 3 decades. These crimes exploded back into the limelight last week after GB News reported that Jess Phillips had rejected calls for a government inquiry into child sexual exploitation in Oldham, one of the places where these heinous crimes took place. Musk then amplified the issue using some pretty incendiary language. He said that Keir Starmer, who was Director of Public Prosecutions during the time these crimes were coming to light, should be in prison, and that he is, quote, deeply complicit in the mass rapes in exchange for votes. And then the tech billionaire called Jess Phillips a rape genocide apologist. Pretty nasty stuff. Andrew, you've written about how the Prime Minister should and did respond to dozens of these tweets issued by Musk. What did you make of the response?
Well, I thought he got it about right. I said that I thought he wasn't going to try and get into a personal fight with Musk, because we know who's going to win with that kind of fight in terms of social media, but that he was going to give a sort of angry but detailed refutation about his role in this terrible, terrible story. And he did it again in the House of Commons. And I think in the views of a lot of knowledgeable observers, he's right. His role is quite good. I talked to one of the most senior lawyers who's been representing victims from all around the country and who knows more about this than almost anybody else, and said, actually, you could see a big change when Starmer got engaged as DPP in this, and the mass prosecution of gangs took another level.
And Andrew Norfolk, who did so much for the Times
Andrew Norfolk,
newspaper.
exactly. The award-winning journalist who launched this in the Times a long time ago said the same thing. So I think on, as it were, the narrow factual position, Starmer has behaved pretty effectively. He only came out fighting really because he was so angry about what was said about Jess Phillips. So in a sense, he came out to protect her rather than his own reputation, but I think he did it very well indeed.
Too slow, though?
It was slow, but then he is slow on these things. And you know, I think the first instinct, just pretend it's not happening, just look the other way. You can't do that with Elon Musk. He's got too many followers. He's too big a player. You can't look the other way. And as I said in my column, you know, you can't bully him. He's too big. You can't bribe him. He's too big. The one thing that you can possibly do is outsit him, because the way he's behaving, he's becoming more and more capricious, more and more extreme, and you just wonder how long he's going to hold that position in the Trump court. He's got J.D. Vance, who thinks that he's going to be the vice president. You know, there's lots of tensions in there, and a prime minister with 4 years still to run can afford to sit back a bit. I think this is a lot more than trolling now. Story in the Financial Times today suggesting that Musk has been talking to advisors about how to remove Starmer as Prime Minister before the election. And we all kind of shake our heads and think that's absolutely absurd and ridiculous.
It's outrageous.
And outrageous. But of course, you know, you can't do it via Reform UK or by an opposition party. But both Tony Blair and Boris Johnson were removed by their own parties because they were very unpopular at the time. And in both cases, they had an alternative internally who's moving to try to get rid of them. First round, it was Gordon Brown. And then second time, of course, it was the Conservative MPs who were panicking. So I think it is not impossible that Musk is looking about he takes this very personally. He uses the word evil about Starmer. I think it's not impossible that Musk is looking at Starmer and thinking quite seriously about how to remove the British Prime Minister. That is an absolutely extraordinary act of intervention in our politics by a foreigner.
I'd go further. It's not just an intervention, is it? It's almost a coup.
If it happened.
Yeah,
if it happened.
But and it's not just that FT story. You can see in some of his tweets, he called for the King to dissolve Parliament. Elon Musk seems to think that because the polls show that the Labour government is very unpopular, that means the Labour government is illegitimate, which is an intriguing way at looking at democracy and how elections work. And he also ran a poll of, I think the question, it wasn't even phrased as a question, it was America should liberate Britain. Yes or no? And unsurprisingly, yes, won quite substantially. But I find it, I think if I were an MP from any party, even from the Conservatives who, absolutely hated Labour and hated Starmer, I'd feel quite uncomfortable about the richest man in the world who's not a British citizen doing a poll on whether another country should liberate us.
And of course, it's not just us, it's the Germans and the French he's going for, and all sorts of people he's going for as well. I think there are 2 or 3 things that protect Starmer and protect all of us against this. First of all, Elon Musk hasn't the faintest clue about the British Constitution, as Rachel was suggesting just a second. Secondly, his fate will depend in the short to medium term on Labour MPs, the people who probably hate Musk more than anybody else. The idea that he's going to win them over is going to be very hard for him to effect. And then I think, thirdly, there is a general patriotic recoil, flinch away from this kind of thing, including by, I would have thought, most mainstream Conservative voters as well.
Well, plenty of food for thought. I want to take us back to the discussion that's dominated the news, obviously, in 2025, because at the heart of this, despite the misinformation and the mischievous comments made by various people, there is a serious scandal. Across England, we know in Rotherham, in Oldham, Telford, Oxford, Rochdale and more, young white girls suffered the most vile, depraved sexual abuse and rape at the hands of men of predominantly Pakistani heritage. And this is a story that involves cover-up. There has been a fear of causing offence or appearing to be racist. And there has been a complete failure on the part of some of those whose job it was to protect these girls. They didn't believe them when they told them they were being raped. Now, because of the furore there's a clamour now for a new national inquiry. Why and who are some of the voices calling for this?
So there are a couple of things to say on this. One is you're absolutely right that this scandal did involve cover-up at all kinds of multi-layers of local government and public institutions and police forces. But that cover-up is in the past. We have known many of the details, maybe not all the details, but we've known about this for about a decade now. There have been documentaries made. All papers have covered it over that time period. There was a very pretty harrowing docu-dramatisation, Three Girls, starring Maxine Peake, that sort of went into it. So the fact that Elon Musk is just discovering that this happened now doesn't mean that the details have been covered up until now. A lot of these details have been in the public domain. There just hasn't been widespread public attention on it. And we should probably think a little bit about why that is and why it hasn't got the attention that it deserves. In terms of inquiries, there have been council-led local inquiries in some of these areas, and there was a huge 7-year inquiry into child sexual abuse generally that took in some of these cases.
The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse.
Yes.
ICSA.
By Professor Alexis Jay, and she made a number of recommendations, and that reported in 2022 when the Conservatives were in power, and most of those recommendations were not fully implemented.
None of them. None of them have been implemented.
18 of the 21 were accepted, but none of them were actually implemented.
And they go through everything from the amount of compensation that survivors should get to how we collect data to just the speed it takes to take these cases through the court system, because if it takes sort of 3 years for a case to come to court, then the trial falls apart and the victim no longer wants to come forward. And also a point that the government has now, in the last couple of days, said that it will move forward on, this idea of mandatory reporting, that if you know that abuse is going on and you don't report it, then that's a criminal offence. And so that's aimed at sort of tackling some of the institutional cover-ups. Now, the national inquiry that is being called for, in addition to that, there are, I think, pretty strong arguments on both sides, and it's worth pointing out that there isn't a kind of united view from survivors on it. Some survivors don't want this because they want action now. They want the recommendations from the Jay inquiry to be implemented in full. They don't want anything that will delay that further. And, if the Jay inquiry took 7 years, they can't wait another 7 years for justice.
It's worth pointing out that the ICSA actually intentionally excluded those places where we already knew that grooming gangs
I think
were
Rotherham
worse.
is mentioned about 3 times, if that, in the
Telford's
ICSA
not
report.
mentioned once,
Telford's
I
not
don't
mentioned for. So,
The argument for doing the inquiry is exactly that. There hasn't been one specifically on this issue, and there hasn't been one that looks at all the places, Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, all of these towns, and tries to draw it together and look at the patterns, look at the relationships between the police and social services, between local government, and also that holds individuals accountable. And the reason I think survivors are split on this is there are some who think it will take too long, but there are also some who say, hang on, there were people in positions of authority who knew about this, who did nothing and have faced no consequences whatsoever. So a national inquiry that had the power to summon those individuals and make them give evidence under oath, there is an accountability question there where people are sort of held up and questioned and said, hang on, you were in charge of this council, you brought this information, what did you do about it? So I think there are strong arguments on both sides for it. Obviously, it is now turned into something of a political football, which I think is really quite distasteful.
I spoke this week to one of the women who was raped in Rotherham. She suffered 4.5 years of rapes as a teenager. And she very much wants an inquiry. And her argument is that most of the councils where this happened were under Labour control. She feels there is a party political aspect to this, and she is blazingly angry about the cover-up, not surprisingly. I think there's no doubt that if there was a specific inquiry into Pakistani grooming gangs, which looked at not only the local cover-ups, but why, as Rachel was raising there, nationally, there was relatively little attention to it, and therefore the sort of culture of Islamophobia and don't talk about this. Then I think it would be painful and difficult for the Labour Party. Not, I think, because any minister, not because Keir Starmer or Jess Phillips or anybody like that would be fingered for it, but because a lot of Labour councillors and a lot of, as it were, wanting to be politically correct police chiefs were part of the cover-up. And I think that would then change that would then shift the national debate around Islamophobia, around community relations in a much wider way, which is, I think, what a lot of people pushing for this inquiry actually want.
But I think, we know, maybe the dozen or so towns where this has happened. I mean, it's worth pointing out, we just don't, the 7-year inquiry itself said we have no idea what the extent of this is. And, let's just point out, in Rochdale alone, 1,400 girls are thought to be victims of this. One town. Yeah. So
it's not half a dozen, though. It's at least 50 towns around England.
Yeah, but of the ones that we talk about, yes. So it's far more widespread than any of these local inquiries have ever looked at.
And I was also talking to Sarah Champion this week, the Rotherham MP who has done so much early on to raise this. She is absolutely convinced this is still going on under our noses right now all around Britain.
So I think that is the other very strong argument for a national inquiry is we don't know that this isn't still happening. And there are all kinds of issues at play with the way certain communities are treated, with the way that public services like social services or the police treat women or young girls of a certain demographic who's believed to be credible, who's thought to be worth paying attention to and protecting, and who isn't. I think there's also a issue here probably of police corruption, because it is almost inevitable that police forces knew about this. And,
they did.
But were possibly, and we know how organised crime works with police forces, that were incentivised to turn a blind eye, and we don't know that it's not still happening. We don't know that that's been dismantled. The unease I have with the sudden ferocity of, obviously there should be a national inquiry and Labour don't want to because it would be awkward for Labour, is the Conservatives could have launched a national inquiry and they didn't. So is it because they thought it would be damaging for them because they were in power, or is it because they just didn't care that much and now they care because it's in the news, which I feel really uncomfortable about. And it's very strange to watch Kemi Badenoch and
Robert
Chris
Jenrick.
Philp and Robert Jenrick, all now on the broadcast waves being like, we're in a national inquiry now, and you go, hang on, you never raised this.
We know
at
why.
any point.
We know why they're doing it now. They're doing it now because they're trying to oil up to Elon Musk. It's
Yeah,
absolutely
it's disgusting.
clear. And Elon Musk is playing that game as well by instantly retweeting Kemi Badenoch. And we come back to the role of somebody like Elon Musk in our politics. He's like this kind of hugely powerful malign magnet that attracts attention and attracts politicians from right across the spectrum, either because they're repulsed by him or because they want to oil up to him.
Yeah, I just want to take a step. We do know that, I mean, I was listening back to an interview with Victoria Derbyshire, who was then at the time on BBC Radio 5 Live, talking to the then Chief of Police for Greater Manchester Police back in 2013. And so at this point, some trials had started of these rape gangs, but it was still unfolding. And the attitude of the police, even then, listening to him defend. So police were told, sometimes by social workers, sometimes by the girls themselves, of what was happening. And there was a view by some that, well, some of these girls are just slags or prostitutes, or it's consensual. 13-year-old girls,
12-year-old consenting to,
It really is quite staggering. Or, well, they say they don't mind, so we're not going to prosecute. They're here being told of child rape.
I would urge people to seek out the film of parliamentary inquiries interviewing police officers, particularly from Yorkshire, on this subject. They are completely pathetic, and it would make your blood boil.
Indeed. I mean, talking about the Conservatives lurching to appeal to Elon Musk, this all actually kicked off on the Musk front with quite a strange tweet about saying that Tommy Robinson, the former leader of the English Defence League on the far right, should be freed from prison. Now, I had the odd experience of spending the day with Tommy Robinson back in...
The very dubious non-honour?
Non-honour, yeah, in 2010. So it's a long time ago now, back in Luton. He's an interesting character. But this to me signifies the level of misinformation and clearly people using this for their own political purposes, because it is true that Tommy Robinson has highlighted this issue a fair bit over a significant number of years. It is not true that he has uncovered anything new or specific that's led to any criminal prosecutions. In fact, he nearly collapsed a trial in 2018. There has been cover-up in the past, for sure. Tommy Robinson is not a victim of being shut down by the British state. So it is all started from this false premise that we're not allowed to talk about this disgusting episode in history.
Elon Musk has been on the side of Tommy Robinson or tweeting about him and tweeting about his cause since before all of this. He was retweeting his videos and talking about him over the summer. And to go back to what we were saying at the beginning, Elon Musk, not a British citizen, seems to have a quite sketchy grasp of UK law, which is totally fine. Like British law, American law, different.
Yeah.
But seems to believe, I think he calls us censorship island, but seems to believe that Tommy Robinson is sort of a political prisoner who is in prison for speaking the truth.
I'm pretty sure the US has contempt of court laws actually as well.
Yeah, but maybe they don't apply to Elon Musk. I mean, this is the guy who called a British diver a paedophile and didn't face any kind of...
Pedo guy.
For rescuing.
He got sued.
Yeah, but he won.
He won because, as I understand it, pedo guy was accepted to be a perfectly normal, rather mild South African insult that they threw at each other all the time, and therefore it wasn't really meant in that way.